The Station of the Cross presents Sermons for Everyday Living. Powerful sermons from faithful and inspirational priests.
Our sermon for today is entitled, What is Laziness, Sloth, and Workaholicism, and Their Dangers?
In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, amen. Direct, O Lord, all our actions by thy holy inspirations, and carry them on by thy gracious assistance, so that every prayer and work of ours may be in from thee and by thee, be happy through Christ our Lord. Amen. Virgin most powerful, pray for us. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, amen. So I wanted to do a conference on laziness, and I think as we get through this, you'll see why. Part of people's experience is, of course, that people are getting more and more lazy. They just don't want to work, obviously. And you can see that as time goes on, getting people just to do any form of work whatsoever is becoming more and more difficult. And then if you imply to them that, hey, maybe you should get this done, they get miffed and irritated with you, etc. So, which we're going to talk a little bit about that psychology as we go along. But I just want to give a couple of examples of, I think, that gives us a sense of how lazy people can be. So this actually happened to me about 7 years ago. I was actually visiting a doctor, and after the appointment, because I told the doctor I needed a name brand prescription because the generic stuff wouldn't work for me. So she said, "You're right, let's do this." So she writes it out on the prescription note. She walks, and then we go out of her office. She walks up to the woman whose job it is to put it into the computer, hands her the thing that says name brand only. I'm not sure exactly how they put that in medicalese, but name brand only. And then she tells her, make sure you click the button that says, or the box that says name brand only. She's like, yeah, okay. Didn't even bother to do it. Right? Literally, it was literally a case. All she had to do is click this. By the time it was done, I'm going to return to this particular phenomenon later, but by the time it was done, I ended up blowing 5 hours of my time and making 11 phone calls to get it straightened out, right? And I finally wrote the doctor and I said, you're one of the best doctors I've ever had, but you've got a problem with your staff. Of course, it got straightened out because she was a good doctor and knew what she was doing. But anyway, this is the type of thing you see where people are literally too lazy even to press a button. And if you ask them to press the button, if they press the button, they act like they have just run a 26-mile marathon to accommodate this desire of yours that really shouldn't have been placed on them, right? That's kind of the way they act. But we also see this with kids coming out of college and stuff like that. When they go to work, they don't want to work. In fact, they'll spend more time. In fact, I think I was reading somewhere where they said the average person now on the job spends somewhere between 20 and 25% of their day on their own phone, doing their own thing, independently of the actual job that they do, right? I imagine it ebbs and flows, depends on where you're at. But they still want top dollar for doing nothing, right? And so this is kind of what we're starting to see. You also see a phenomenon which my uncle pointed out. This was way back in the 80s. He pointed out, there's some people that they actually spend more time and energy trying to avoid work than if they would just do it, right? And so we're seeing that phenomenon, where people will go to extraordinary lengths rather than actually lift a finger. Okay. So I want to talk about what laziness is, how to avoid it, how it's different from sloth, because it's actually very different from sloth, although we tend to think of them in the same way. And then also the opposite of laziness, which is workaholism, and what the common characteristics of that are, and what the defects that can arise, or daughters, as they say, that can arise from that. Okay, so laziness. The word in Latin for lazy is ociosus, which means idle, but it can also imply unconcerned, useless, or unprofitable. This was the word that we actually see in the Vulgate when Christ is talking to the guys that are standing. It's in the parable, right, where the guy goes out and he says, hey, go out and I'll pay you X amount. And then he comes out a few hours later and there's guys standing there saying, hey, go out and just, and then finally it gets to the end of the day and there's guys who've been standing around all day. This is why you've been standing around all day is how they translate it. But it's actually, the word they use is ociosus, is the word they use in Latin referring to why have you been idle or lazy all day, literally is what it means. And then they say, well, no one's hired us. So then he says, well, then go out and do it. But the point being is that this indicates something in which a person is willing to be idle rather than do something. So the definition of lazy is it's an unwillingness to work or use energy, averse or disinclined to work, activity or exertion, indolent, sometimes how they'll refer to it as, wanting to avoid activity or exertion. Okay. It is primarily a physical thing. So if you actually look at it, the person, laziness is primarily in the irascible appetite, where it doesn't want to engage something that's physically arduous. However, it's got a concomitant correspondence in the will in which the person simply has chosen or does not want to engage in things that require physical exertion. Okay. So it's basically an unwillingness to work or use energy. Okay. It's primarily a physical thing and not a spiritual thing. And it doesn't deal with spiritual goods as such. It actually deals with physical exertion in doing those particular things on a physical level. Whereas sloth, as we'll see, is actually a sorrow or an aversion towards those things that are the spiritual goods because they require exertion on a different kind of a level, in a different way. So laziness is a kind of sadness at exertion or work. It is a turning away from the pain involved in work, so it's part of Adam's curse. So one of the things that happened was when Adam came out of the gate after the fall, God said to him, that you'll have to work in pain and suffering, etc. So it's the work part means that that's the punishment that he has to do. He did give men a natural inclination to want to do those things. So as men, when we do something that requires a lot of physical exertion, we get it done and it's done well. There's a certain satisfaction in seeing it. This is why, for example, mechanics actually like their work, because even though it's physically demanding, when it's finished and the thing runs, we're like, okay, that's awesome, right? Okay, so there's that natural inclination, but that also means that concomitantly as part of the curse of Adam, that men have a tendency towards laziness. This is one of the reasons why guys have to actually work at it and chisel away at it. So a lot of times when guys come home from work, they just want to be inert and they don't want to have to work or do anything. When in point in fact, there should be, obviously they do need to rest because work can actually be exhausting when they're at work. But at the same time, when they come home, there can kind of be this, okay, I just worked, I don't want to have to do any more type of thing. So this is part of the curse of Adam. It seeks comfort. In other words, people who are lazy just want to be comfortable and take delight in the doing of nothing, right? But this comfort is not the primary aspect of it. Its primary aspect is the avoidance of the pain or the difficulty in in exertion. Just having to force your body to do something because it doesn't want to do it. This is, again, part of the curse of original sin, both in women and in men. But it's where the body just doesn't want to have to exert any kind of energy to do anything. Okay. Laziness is contrary to two virtues. It's primarily contrary to diligence, which is primarily in the will, but it shows itself in the irascible appetite, which is the irascible appetite is the one in which it engages things that are arduous on a physical level. So, but diligence is primarily in the will. So what is diligence? Diligence is due solicitude towards the care and making sure that what needs to be done is done. So the diligence can be not just in area of work, it can also be in study and things of that sort. But it's basically a form of discipline, which we'll see a little bit later. It's a form of discipline in which a person does what he needs to do when he needs to do it, despite the fact that you might not feel it. It's also against magnificence. Now, magnificence comes from the two Latin words magnus and facere, which means to do a great thing. And in that sense, normally magnificence is in the stricter sense, refers to people of means can provide the money so that great edifices or great things can be accomplished with the money, right? Okay. So there's that. But magnificence can also just be in the average person's life where he strives to, achieve great things within his state in life, right? A lot of times people will try and go outside of that. We'll see that in relationship to workaholism. But it's the desire to achieve great things within my capacities to do so. St. Thomas even says it's also against magnanimity. That is, it's a kind of a pusillanimity of smallness of soul, because the person would rather mire down in mediocrity and just sitting there than actually force himself to do something in order to achieve something. And so what happens is that their appetites become trained and accustomed and to desiring the comfort of doing nothing, right? Okay. Which you can kind of see in most millennials and Gen Zs. Not all of them, but most of them. Okay. Yeah, laziness is a kind of sadness, as I mentioned, exertion or work. So there is the sadness in a certain sense is in the concupiscible appetite, but the actual pain or experience of the thing and aversion and turning away from it is in the irascible appetite. So it is contrary to magnificence, magnanimity, greatness of soul, because people who are lazy will never achieve greatness of soul. So obviously, we don't want to get to the point where we're just working all the time, thinking that's going to make us great, have greatness of soul as well. It's really the greatness of soul is in consummate with virtue, so that I work when I need to work without shirking my work or shrinking from it. Okay. St. Thomas says that in relationship to laziness, it begets a kind of complacentia, a satisfaction, as I mentioned, in mediocrity. They like the mediocrity. Now, from time to time, people might I don't like being mediocre, but I would rather sit and get the pleasure of doing nothing than actually achieve something great and actually have to work. It's a sign of a lack of discipline. So what exactly is discipline? Technically speaking, it's a twofold thing. It's primarily a virtue in the will in which a person consistently applies himself to the work or to the job or to the work here, we're using it in the word opus in Latin, to the thing or the activity that needs to be done. So it's a consistent application to the thing when it needs to be done. And so it's a strength in the will, moving the other faculties to perform the actions that are necessary to achieve or to get something done. And so the discipline can be in work, it can be in all different areas of our life. It can be in study, it can also be in relationship to just physically working out and staying in shape and things of that sort. Okay. So that being the case, it consists of an interior self-mastery and control. So it's the will having mastery and control over the lower faculties, specifically the concupiscible appetite, but also over the irascible appetite, having mastery and control over them and able to move them to perform these things without them throwing a big kerfluffle over the fact that they don't want to engage in these things that are painful or difficult. So it's an interior self-mastery and control in relationship to those things that are physically difficult. Here we're talking about it specifically in relationship to as a counteracting to laziness. So it's in the will, it's primarily in the will, but it needs, in order for the will to apply it quickly and consistently and to have that self-mastery implies that the lower faculties have to be subjugated through a willingness to suffer and a willingness to engage in things that are painful and difficult. As men, specifically, we find that engaging in things that require a certain amount of physical exertion and are actually painful or even difficult to a certain degree, not ridiculously so, but that we're actually able to achieve those, that, as I mentioned, because of our inclination as men to have predominance in relationship to the activities of the irascible appetite, moreover the concupiscible appetite, whereas with women it's concupiscible appetite, specifically in the area of modesty, is where their predominance is. But in relationship to men, it's that inclination to engage in things that are arduous and difficult. That means that we get a satisfaction once we achieve that. And so there is a pleasingness in those things, but a person has to be trained to be able to take joy and delight in those things that are painful and difficult. So it's an interior mastery. It's primarily an interior thing where the person has application of will and subduing of the appetites to be able to engage in something that's physically difficult. It implies a consistent application to doing what is difficult. Men who are lazy, in the end, therefore are unmanly, because we have an inclination to being disciplined and doing these things. And when we're not, that's an indicator that we know we're not being manly. And hence, it is against magnificence, or actually against magnanimity. Okay. Generally, laziness is considered a venial sin unless there is an obligation that one has to fulfill, and one fails to do so. By here, obligation, we're talking about something that's grave. We're not talking about just emptying the dishwasher or something like that, but, someone just fails to, make sure that a particular thing is done, and as a result, it would save the company millions of dollars, but instead he's too lazy, he would rather just do nothing, which is kind of an interesting thing I find about millennials. In addition to having no scruples whatsoever about blowing large amounts of your time and making your life miserable, they have no difficulty of the fact that it might cost you large sums of money just because they don't have to press this button. That doesn't bother them at all that they don't press the button, as long as it doesn't cost them any money, right? And if it does cost them any money, then there's indignation, which I'll talk about here in a minute. There's indignation at the fact that you took their money away because they didn't do their job, right? Okay. But anyway, it's normally venial. It's normally grave if the obligation to perform that function is grave, or it has grave consequences, okay? One of the effects, the upshot, the long-term effect of this is poverty. In the end, laziness is going to just lead to not having a lot of money, because you're just going to be not doing work in order necessary to achieve it. Okay, what are the daughters of laziness? The first is obvious: negligence. The person just fails to do their job. They don't do what they're supposed to do. And this also means that people who are lazy and therefore negligent are inherently unreliable. You can't trust them to get the job done. And so you end up having to work around them or figure ways around them. Lazy people are dangerous in the end because they're willing to let you suffer or even die rather than lift a finger. That's kind of where we're at in all this. So but its primary has to do, so in addition to being unreliable, it's just negligence. That's what you see them consistently do. They put stuff off to the last minute. They just keep putting it off. And then because it's right at the last minute, they hurry it right along, and then it's done poorly or not done at all. Or eventually they just justify in themselves that it's just okay to let this go, etc. And then other people end up suffering as a result of it. And this means that one part of the negligence means that that one of the daughters of laziness is injustice towards others, as one does not do what one ought, and so others have to pick up the slack. And this again doesn't seem to bother the millennials. It's funny because you'll see there's their job. They're telling them it's supposed to be the job, and you'll even remind them this is supposed to be your job. And they'll just blow you off because they're irritated that you are pointing something out to them. In their mind, you're attacking them rather than trying to help them along. And so then if you just stop and do it yourself, you'll either get the indignation of, well, I was going to do that. Well, it didn't appear that way because you're just standing there, right? Or it doesn't faze them at all. In fact, they're kind of delighted that now they didn't have to do this thing that they were supposed to do. Okay. It literally is a case where we really need to go back to, if you do not work, you don't eat, as Christ said, rather than, letting them just kind of float along in society. Laziness can occur when there's not grave need, right? If people are in grave need, they can't be lazy. They have to actually work, otherwise they're going to starve to death. Okay. So it's a lack of charity. So, for example, leaving the dishes laying around and the like. They also, one of the things I've noticed about people who are lazy, it doesn't seem to bother them in the slightest, A, to live in squalor, and B, it doesn't bother them in the slightest that you're suffering their squalor by being around it. It doesn't seem to bother them, And in fact, if you tell them, but in fact, if you tell a lazy person, maybe you ought to clean this up so the rest of us don't have to deal with it, they'll what you always get, it's not that bad, or, it's no, you can deal with it. In other words, it's just another way not to have to exert themselves. Okay. We also, in the context of this squalor issue, we're starting to see the rise of a phenomenon, I call it the white trash phenomenon, which is basically what we're seeing is not all just millennials. By the way, the only reason I pick on millennials is because they're easy targets. You can just point at it and everybody says, yeah, I see it, right? But in relationship to them, one of the things that you notice is that they'll move into a house, they don't mow the lawn, they don't bother to make sure it's cleaned up or painted, they don't take care of anything, and it just slowly declines over the course of time. Now, this is not all millennials, of course. Here we're talking about some of them. So what we're seeing is kind of an increase in the whole white trash kind of phenomenon. This is one of the reasons why it kind of changed there for a little while, but we might be going back to it again, is that a lot of millennials didn't want to own a house because it just simply required too much work, right? And so they just didn't want to deal with it. So they would move into condos or things like that so they didn't have to mow the lawn, they didn't have to repair anything, they didn't have to do anything. It was just easier for them to do that. Or into apartments, because they just don't want to have to take care of anything, because again, they don't want to exert themselves. Over the course of time, because the person is lazy but still keeps getting fed, so if parents allow their kids to be lazy, then what happens is the kid keeps getting fed, he keeps getting a nice house to live in, or 3 hots and a cot, as they used to say. And so over the course of time, his attitude is, you owe these things to me, even though I don't have to do anything to merit them. And so over the course of time, laziness starts to engender an entitlement mindset. And they start to expect others to fulfill their needs and wants. And if you don't, there's something wrong with you. I mean, literally, they'll just sit there and expect you to clean up around them rather than them just cleaning up their own mess. Right? In fact, if you point out their mess, you get all this indignation from them as a result of it. It's hatred. Another daughter is hatred and envy towards those who actually do accomplish something. So, for example, I had a friend of mine who's part of the millennial generation, and he actually started successfully an online conservative magazine for women, and it did extraordinarily well. And now he's developing and he's becoming entrepreneurial and things like that. But he told me that when he would go to social engagements with people of his same age, he stopped talking about everything that he was accomplishing because they would become envious and indignant that he was actually doing something with his life, right? And of course, they would always couch it in terms of the whole communist thing. Oh, you're becoming a capitalist. You're like all these other people. Yeah, you're just lazy is what the real issue is. But this is the thing that you begin to see is they start to have hatred and envy towards those who actually do accomplish. And by envy, I mean in the sense of they're indignant that you actually accomplished this thing and really you didn't deserve it, and really it should come to me, even though I didn't do anything to deserve it, etc. Another one is rancor. This is a resentfulness, especially when it's long-standing. So in other words, they become difficult and acrimonious to live around. So how do you overcome it? Well, it basically comes from application of hard work. So this is one of the reasons I tell parents, you really do need to have a moderated, it can't be excessive, but there has to be a moderated engaging, especially for the boys, of work that's difficult and painful so that he can learn to appreciate it. And you have to reward him for it, and you actually have to praise him when he does do a good job, etc., so that they learn the value of the work and that they can, even though it's something that we're going to deal with as long as we're alive because of the effect of original sin of weakness as one of the wounds of the irascible appetite because of original sin. It's something we're always going to be dealing with. So you're always going to have to, whenever you have to do a hard job, there's always going to kind of be that, oh, I don't want to do this. But if he has that diligence, he'll get into it and overcome that. He has to set goals, not just, in the forms of making money, but also he should set goals and even in things that are materially ordered to some degree. We need to work on charity and zeal that arises from it, because zeal, we'll see this, is the antidote to sloth, but it's also the antidote to being lazy. If a person is really zealous for the things that pertain to God, they won't just sit around. They're going to want to actually do something in order to promote people's love of God. Often it is done when young. That is, if you can develop that discipline when you're younger, it is easier to maintain when you get older. But what I've noticed is that if people have been lazy their whole life, once they get into their mid-20s and they've never developed any discipline in a particular area, it's brutal and hard-going and highly unlikely that they'll overcome it. So it's very similar. There's something, they do talk about this in some of the brain studies, but there's kind of a quickening in the intellect that actually, or in the brain that actually occurs from about 18 to 22, 23. And that's why I tell people it's the same thing with, if a man doesn't learn how to use a set of tools by the time he's 25, it's over. He's never going to be good at it. He's never going to master it. At least I've never seen anybody. They don't even know how to hold a screwdriver properly, right? It's that kind of a thing. Well, it's the same thing with laziness. If they don't master it when they're younger and it's not developed, that discipline, it's unlikely that they're going to go over to they're going to ever master it fully. They have to find motivations for hard work. But see, okay, why do I want to do this? Why do I want to engage in this? Okay. Now, so laziness deals with exerting yourself and engaging in things that are sorrowful in relationship to physical exertion. Whereas sloth is not that. We tend to use sloth sometimes in relationship to English, but sloth is a spiritual sin, insofar as sloth is a sorrow at spiritual things. It's a actual sorrow. I don't want to have to engage in spiritual things. And so why is this important? Well, even in the traditional movement, we're starting to notice that a lot of priests, we call them lazy. And because they won't hear confessions, they won't go out of the way to help the people, they won't add that extra mass so that people can actually get to mass because they just don't want to have to do the hassle or what have you. But the moral of the story is that is not actual laziness, even though we call it laziness. It's actually spiritual sloth. These men, when it comes to spiritual goods, especially in relationship to other people, find them sorrowful and don't want to engage in them. So sloth is defined as an attachment to pleasure. It's an attachment to pleasure with and an unwillingness to engage what is arduous, but specifically in the area of the spiritual life. So sloth is different from effeminacy. Effeminacy is primarily an attachment to the pleasure, whereas sloth is an aversion towards those things that require spiritually to work hard to achieve those things that are hard, right? So discipline is not going to be just in what I do physically. It's also going to mean discipline in relationship to, which means my will has a strength in applying itself to spiritual matters, despite the fact that the lower appetites don't want to engage them. And so this is how we overcome sloth, obviously. But this in sloth, the person would rather they tend towards the pleasure and things that are comfortable. They want a comfortable priesthood, for example. But the fact is that they tend towards that precisely because they have an aversion towards things that are sacred. They only want to engage in those things that are sacred that feed their appetites. If it's not going to feed their appetites, they're going to have an aversion towards it. So it's actual sorrow at spiritual things, and it's an unwillingness to engage in the spiritual things because they're difficult. So what are the signs of someone who is slothful? Well, they have a distaste for doing what is virtuous. It requires self-denial. It requires that a form of penance. So they have a distaste for penance and self-denial on a regular basis. We'll see why that's important later. They have a distaste for prayer. Or they can have a distaste for certain kinds of prayer. So you can get people who will do boatloads of vocal prayer because they get a sign of pleasure out of it and it's easy and they feel like they're accomplishing something. But when it comes to doing meditation, they bristle at it. They don't want to do it, right? And so they give all sorts of excuses. They'll cut corners in prayer. They'll put off or neglect the prayer. Spiritual dissipation. This is a decline in one's spiritual life where one starts engaging in things in the world in order to avoid having to deal with the spiritual things that they should actually be doing. One of the hallmarks of the 40s and 50s was precisely this element. Because modernism transposes the objective standard of truth from reality to one's own experience, then one's own experience is going to be based on whether I get pleasure out of it or I don't get pleasure. Whether it's delightful or whether it's sorrowful is going to determine whether I think it's good or bad. So one of the things that you began to see in the people in the 40s and 50s was a spiritual sloth. And the way you would notice it is the fact that it's during that time that there's lots of complaining about priests saying Mass in a sloppy fashion, in a hurried way, unreverent, etc. Because doing that to do it properly requires discipline. To maintain your focus through Mass requires a tremendous amount of discipline. And so you began to see that spiritual sloth overtake them. And this would be the case because of the fact that spiritual goods are precisely things that cause pain to us, at least initially, in relationship to our own experience, right? So when you engage in penance, it's painful. When God starts purifying you, it's painful. When he starts dragging you through the path of purification, it's painful, right? And so if you're going to transpose your criteria from reality to yourself, you're going to have an aversion to things that are sacred. And the hallmark of that aversion to the sacred, we saw. They got rid of the Mass. They got rid of all the discipline of the church. They got rid of all the beauty of the church, all these things in the church. They just got rid of them and had a visceral hatred for it. But that was also an indicator that the precursor to that was spiritual sloth. This is going to be the real danger. So what's the point? If you suffer from spiritual sloth, you're not going to do what's necessary in order to achieve what is beautiful in the liturgy, in a church, and making sure it's done right or that it's taken care of, etc., because of the fact that requires an interior discipline. As I mentioned, it's a distaste for the sacred because it's arduous. And so this is something that we're actually seeing now, even more, even among trads. One of the signs that people are spiritually slothful and don't want to is that when they hear that they should be praying or when they should be doing these things, they will criticize the priest who tells them that because they don't want to have to admit that what he says is true, because then they'd actually have to change their life and get their act together, right? So this is something that we're seeing more and more as time goes on. So what are the daughters of sloth? Well, one of them is rancor again. They become resentful. This is one of the things that you're seeing in the traditional movement among the traditional priests. The priests that work really hard and sacrifice and practice self-denial and are doing everything they can to beautify the liturgy and things like that are becoming the younger generation of priests. Not all of them, of course, because some of them are very hardworking, but a lot of them are basically slothful and lazy and don't want to do any work. And so they're becoming more and more indignant towards the priests that do, and they start bad-mouthing them and saying bad things against them in order to feel better about themselves, basically. It also begets pusillanimity, bitterness, Despair, in the end, sloth does. Hatred. You start hating the people and hating things that remind you that you really should be getting your act together. They become inconsiderate to other people, because to be considerate to other people means you have to basically engage in the act of sacrifice each time someone asks you for something that requires self-denial on your part. And so they start becoming inconsiderate towards other people, and they get to the point where they find people just annoying and will avoid them. St. Thomas refers in Sloth, he calls inquietude of the body. So the body is not made to sit there, and so we get restless physically. That's true when it comes to spiritual matters. If you notice, when you're doing your prayer life consistently and your prayer is deep, when you come out of it, there is a physical calm and there's a lack of scurrility. When people don't engage in spiritual things on any kind of consistent basis and they're engaging in other things, there's kind of a scurrility where they can't sit still and they have to be doing everything. On the other hand, that inquietude can also be a sign of laziness, because if we're working hard and doing those kinds of things, when you're done, you're ready to sit, right? Okay. Instability, they're unstable. St. Thomas calls this is interesting, one of the effects of sloth is verbosity. They talk a lot, right? And so you'll see this sometimes among the priests. They just want to sit and talk. They just don't want to do anything. Curiosity, and it also kills charity. Now, I have done a longer conference on sloth. I just want to draw these together, that it does have a connection to that. And the principal way you come over to laziness, the principal way you overcome it is through zeal. Okay. Now, what I want to talk about, though, is their common element, discipline. It's when the will has to get to the point where it is applying itself to something contrary to the lower faculties and appetites on a consistent basis to build that virtue and in order to be able to maintain it. So one of the things that we have started to see in our line of work as exorcists is that when you look at the common element of the people that are being attacked, here we're putting aside possession because that's a whole different kind of an animal. But when you see people being attacked spiritually with oppression and obsession, it is a sign that there is some aspect of their spiritual life that there's a lack of discipline. That's what it's a sign of. And what this basically means is that demons avoid the person who on a daily basis practices self-denial. Now here you can have people, and we'll talk about this when we get to the workaholics, who work, do all this physical stuff. They might even do their spiritual life, but they're not moderating their desire to accomplish things in the work, and as a result, that's where the lack of discipline is. So it's the same problem. If you actually look at workaholism and laziness, they have the same root problem, lack of discipline. But the point being is that when it comes to, but we'll parse that out more with workaholism, but what we're finding is that people who develop an elementary discipline, what does that look like in their spiritual life? If they do that, they're not attacked diabolically. Well, it looks like this. It means that on a consistent basis, more than one time a day, each and every day, they have to be denying themselves something consistently all the time. If they do that, so that's why we tell people, okay, do the Angelus 6, noon, and 6, and the Auxilium Christianorum prayer 6, noon, and 6. And people say, well, do I have to get up at 7? Well, you've already defeated the whole point of this. The whole point of this is to get up, to discipline yourself, to apply your will against something that you don't want to do, because getting out of the bed in the morning is not pleasant, right? At least for most of us. So that means if you do that consistently, then what happens is you start to develop that discipline in the will, and the demons will start avoiding you, because they know if you're disciplined, when they come in to suggest something, that because of your discipline, they're more likely to get whacked and taken out, right? And so what we've noticed is those people that suffer from oppression and obsession, it's always because there's some lack of discipline in their life somewhere. And so sometimes we have to kind of parse that out a little bit. But usually it's just elementary. They don't pray with any kind of consistency. They might even say the rosary every day, But it doesn't necessarily, but the rosary for some people doesn't require kind of a self-denial. It has to be something where you're denying yourself every single day. And it has to be consistent, because that's what builds that virtue of discipline. And so if they do that, then they're less likely to get attacked. Okay. So this is something to just kind of keep in mind. This is one of the reasons why I think we're seeing an uptick, not just from diabolic attacks on people who are slothful because they're not doing what they need to on a spiritual level. But as people get lazier and lazier and lazier, we're starting to see an uprise in mental illness. I think some of those mental illnesses, not all of them, but some of those mental illnesses are diabolically caused because the people are just easy prey. Okay. So what about workaholism? So diligence has an excess, and that's workaholism. The opposite is defect, which is laziness. Or in the case of sloth, it can be sloth, okay? So workaholism is excessiveness of solicitude or application of solicitude to something in a disproportionate way. So in other words, you're spending way too much time and energy on something that's above and beyond. So for example, men who become workaholics at work, it's one thing if your job just simply requires a lot of work. It's another thing if you're constantly taking on more work when you could ratchet it back. There's a failure to recognize that the career is there for the family, not the family for the career. That's the most danger that you see with guys in workaholism. And so that's something to keep in mind. So it's an excessive application of solicitude to something worldly, ultimately. It is rooted in an attachment to an accomplishing something. That in accomplishing something, they get the satisfaction of it, or they want the satisfaction, or they want to see it, and so they'll go through extraordinary efforts in order to do this. So I know of a person who did this in their family. The mother had the daughters engage in a particular kind of sport, and it required enormous amounts of time. It took a lot of financial resources and time and away from the family in order to achieve this. They literally did get to the top nationally in that sport. And when you walk into their basement and you see the trophies, it literally lines the wall with trophies, right? And the mother was just completely driven to do this, right? And so it wasn't until a priest told her it's over, and then she finally acquiesced and stopped. But this was something in which a lot of times that when we're workaholics, we can force other people to execute our plans because we want to get these things accomplished. But this particular person, I started noticing and I realized, psychologically, this person is a bulldozer, right? Because they reached the top of this thing. And by bulldozer, I mean, these are the people who are extraordinarily driven, which is actually can be a good thing if it's moderated, but they see something they want to accomplish and they just beeline it for that thing, and there is no consideration for any of the circumstances, and they get this thing and they accomplish it, and then they look around and there's this phenomenal collateral damage all around them and just human wreckage. And they're like, what happened? They literally can't see it. And so this is something that has to be really watched for workaholics, because they'll start doing that where they end up causing a lot of damage around them. Or sometimes people will do it in attachment to prove themselves. I have to prove myself that I'm good. I'm good enough to do this. There's also sometimes it's driven by a fear of not accomplishing something or fear of not achieving an excellence, that people look down on me if I don't achieve something, or they have a pride and estimation of something. I'm a person that is magnificent. They don't think that way, or I'm a great person, and so I have to achieve this thing so everyone else will realize I'm a great person. When in the end, nobody thinks anybody else is great anyway. So it is precisely a lack of discipline in regards to desire and refraint of the irascible appetite and wanting to achieve. It's a lack of discipline, because what's happening is the will is not refraining the irascible appetite's going to excess. So even though the irascible appetite can be by defect, where we don't want to engage anything and be slothful and lazy, it's the opposite, where the will doesn't refrain the appetite towards wanting to pursue the greatness that, or some thing outside of them that they consider great. but it may not be proper to their state in life or what have you. So ultimately, that too is a lack of self-discipline and self-mastery. Ultimately, they're not mastering those interior appetites. As I mentioned, it's rooted in pride. They want to be known as not having failed or having accomplished something. Sometimes it can be rooted in a woundedness, that they do it in order to show themselves or feel good about themselves that they're not a failure or that they're not bad, like their woundedness might indicate to them because of their past experience. Often the work becomes more planned and than expected. This can kind of happen. One of the signs, if they plan something and then they realize they get into it, that it's 10 times more work than they had realized, that's a sign that they're a bit too ambitious in that regard. It can result in chronic exhaustion. They're prone to burning themselves and others out in order to achieve this goal. Usually the goal that they want to achieve also is not proportionate. In fact, it's usually far inferior to the spiritual goods they would achieve if they simply backed off on that stuff and started focusing on their own spiritual lives and working on that. And so this is one of the reasons why in our culture, we're very prone to workaholism in the sense of, that you're really only contributing to society if you're actually getting something done, which ironically is also communist as well, right? In the communist scheme, the contemplative life or the semi-contemplative life, or even the intellectual life or a life of leisure so that you can actually reflect on things and advance a man intellectually, is to be found nowhere, right? Because for them, work, they're there to produce. And we have a bit of that in our culture as well. This is one of the reasons why capitalists can very easily fall into communism before it's all said and done. They tend to work to forget their troubles or in other spheres of their life. We know that it's a bad sign when it comes before God or family. And this can be a sign. So one of the things I often tell people, because I have friends of mine who are multi-millionaires, but they're quasi-workaholics. And I often tell them, look, I realize that you could achieve great things by making that extra 5 million. But here's the moral of the story. When you're in heaven, that 5 million is going to be nothing. You really need to back it off and start working on having a contemplative life. This is because our Lord himself said it, that Mary had chosen the greater part. And so I often tell people it means if you can get to the point where you can engage in a semi-contemplative life and you don't do it, you're turning down the greater part, right? By doing these other things. Yeah, these things are good and they might be an accomplishment, etc., and they might help people, but in the end, your own soul would be better fashioned in the more contemplative approach by seeing that if I have the means, that's a sign that God is giving me the opportunity, and this is what Pieper talks about in his book, Leisure, the Basis of Culture, that part of the reason for affluence is so that it frees us up from the lower virtues to pursue the higher virtues. And so a lot of times when people are trying to accomplish all these things on a lower level, like this woman that was pushing her kids to accomplish this level in the sports, if she would have just backed it off and focused on the kids' spiritual life, it would have been a whole different animal. So the fact that she was very driven was a good thing. It just needed to be directed and moderated. Because they think they can achieve the good, they do not see their problem in what they are doing. So a lot of times when people are workaholics, don't see that they're causing problems within the family or things of that sort. Demons will mess with workaholics. I know, because I tend to be one of them. I have to moderate it from time to time. And how do you know the demons are messing with you? Well, it's pretty easy. They'll mess with everybody, so don't get me wrong. But with workaholics, one of the things they'll do is you'll start out and you realize, okay, I want to get these 5 things accomplished today. And you'll start out with item A. And you start working on item A, and what should have been a 5-minute job turns into a 3-hour job. And the demons are driving you interiorly. You can feel yourself being driven this way. You got to get this done. You got to get this done. This is really annoying. This isn't getting done. This thing is holding you up to getting all this other stuff done, and now you're going to have to put that off, and this is brutal, and you're going to have to put this. They put you through that whole machination, right, in that process. And so what I learned very early on, especially when we moved to Colorado, is once I recognized that a 5-minute job is starting to protract and it's becoming ridiculous, I would literally shut it off, shut it down, walk away from it, detach from it entirely, go do something else. Even if I don't accomplish a single thing the rest of the day, it doesn't matter, because if I would have applied myself to this thing, I would have taken the whole day and I still wouldn't have gotten it done anyway. So I might as well just let the thing loose, go and relax for a little bit, drink a mint julep. Well, not exactly, but you get the point. The point being is that I would just go work on something else. Even if I didn't get that much done, it didn't matter. And then the next day, when the oppression has stopped, it would take less than 5 minutes. The thing is done, and then I can move on. But the workaholic, they'll mess with things like that, and they'll drive the aggravation interiorly to the person, but they can't get this thing done, right? That's one of the things they'll do. And this is done on purpose. I think that a lot of people have started to notice that as the demons gain greater ascendancy, just the ability to get normal things done, even for normal people, is getting more and more difficult and more belabored. Now, some of it is that our culture is becoming more and more communist, which means people just don't work and stuff just doesn't get done, and it takes forever to get anything done. And so this is because people just don't want to work. And communists always destroy the supply chain, always restrict certain things, always do stuff so that stuff is never going to go well anyway, which is kind of the irony, because communism is all about work and contributing to the good, social good by work, and they do everything they can to sabotage work being efficient and how they set up their system. There's that element, but then there's also just the element of that the demons are dinking with people's stuff more and more and more. So if you find that don't get sucked into just keep driving to try and get this thing done, back away from it, maybe even pray to St. Joseph for a while. That's one of the things I found effective in that regard, praying to St. Joseph and asking him, hey, help me get this done quickly and well, etc., because he was the worker, right? Okay, so this is something that you want to keep in mind. What are the daughters of workaholism? Well, one of them is negligence, specifically their spiritual lives. So what will happen is they'll spend an inordinate amount of time. I said this to a group of guys. I said, do you spend as much time in front of the Blessed Sacrament or praying as you do working out? And most of them said no. I said, well, there's already a problem, right? And so there's a neglect of the spiritual life is one of the signs of workaholism, that you're trying to get so much done. And sometimes it can also be from, well, this is my duty, my obligation, state in life. Yeah, that area might be, but all the things you're doing in that area don't necessarily have to be done. And it also causes other people to neglect their duties, but also they neglect other people, right? Because they're so focused on accomplishing the thing. This is normally a bigger problem for men than for women, because men are ordered towards work and getting things done, whereas women are more ordered towards what's interrelational, for the sake of the family and their role within the family. And so it tends to be more of a problem for the men, although women can do the same thing too. The point I'm drawing out is, in the end, it's ultimately a lack of discipline, because they're not refraining their appetite of wanting to get this thing done, wanting to accomplish this thing, wanting to have these things, etc. They have to be able to curb that and achieve what is necessary, what's proper to their state of life, while at the same time having as their primary focus the spiritual life. So all three of these, laziness, sloth, workaholism, are all rooted in that lack of interior discipline, where the will maintains mastery over the lower faculties and moves them in a moderated way, according to reason, of course, to what it should be done, when it should be done, no more and no less. Okay. So I'll give you a blessing. Benedictio Dei omnipotentis, Patris et Filii et Spiritus in super vos sit et semper. Amen.
This has been Sermons for Everyday Living from the Station of the Cross Catholic Media Network. Please pray 3 Hail Marys for the priest who preached in today's show. To share this episode or to hear it again, find us on your favorite podcasting app under Sermons for Everyday Living. Have a blessed day.
This podcast has been brought to you by the Station of the Cross Catholic Media Network, a listener-funded nonprofit organization. Please prayerfully consider making a donation at thestationofthecross.com or through our free iCatholic radio app. You can also support us by leaving a positive review for this program on your favorite podcasting app and by sharing this episode. Thank you.